Good evening and welcome to this evening's Tortoise Open News meeting. I'm Matt Dancona. I'm an editor at Tortoise, and I'm sure that, like me, you're still processing or trying to process the horrific, unspeakable reports that emerged over the weekend from Bucha on the outskirts of Kiev, and the unspeakable atrocities that were committed there, but not only there, because sadly, but quite clearly, there are many more such incidents and horrors to be uncovered and to be reported in full. I find at moments like this, I scurry back to first principles and to trusted books, and I've been looking again at Hannah Arendt's classic book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and wondering whether it might be possible one day to write a companion volume called Putin in The Hague, recounting the prospective trial at the International Criminal Court of the Kremlin autocrat. I wonder if that will be possible. I'm also reminded of what President Zelensky said to the Bundestag on the 17th of March, which is every year politicians repeat never again, and now we see that these words simply mean nothing. And I think one of the things we want to try and look at this evening is whether they do mean nothing. The question, it always seems to me, is can we assess how great the gap is between the atrocity and taking action in response to it? And if we can assess the gap, can we close that gap? So as ever, we're very keen to hear from you. That's the purpose of our open newsroom events, and all our thinkings. And the chat is overseen this evening by my colleague Seb, so please do chip in there. We're also immensely fortunate to be joined by Dr. Jelke Bursten, who is a professor in gender and development at King's College London, and a globally recognized authority on the role of sexual violence in war, and someone who I think is really, we're very lucky to have in the digital newsroom to talk to and to listen to and to try and get some perspective and sense of what this all means and where it might be heading. So I want to plunge straight in, Jelke, if I may, first of all, to welcome you. Thank you for being here, and talk about, first of all, a specific that I suppose is very important in understanding the whole question of war atrocities, which is rape as a weapon of war, and ask you why, beyond simple depravity, this particular horrific weapon is deployed in wartime.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, it's a bit of a double question. On one hand, and I hope to give a clear but not simplified answer, if I may. So on the one hand, so why is rape so effective as a weapon? No, let's start there. So it refers really to the practice of raping women for the purpose of destroying a community, not only women, no? So we must think that in patriarchal societies, women are often seen as the property of men, and women's sexuality is often tied to a community or a family's honor. And I don't think that Ukraine or Russia is different in that sense, no? So when you rape women, you don't only destroy the women, but you also destroy the men and the community. So it has a fragmentating effect, because communities tend to turn into themselves and against each other, often against their women as well, because of shame and embarrassment and the feeling of disempowerment and so on. And because sexual violence is so very intimate and tied to reproduction, of course, it can also be very harmful to communities' self-perception, creating further fragmentation. So that idea of sort of a personal fragmentation of trauma, what happens to women when they're raped, has a ripple effect, a very strong, deep effect on the community at large. Now, why am I saying that it's not as straightforward? Because I doubt that even Putin is sitting at his desk thinking, and now I'm going to send in my soldiers to rape women because that's so effective as a weapon of war. That doesn't happen. It tends to be, there don't tend to be orders from above, but at the same time, there tends to be a facilitation of an environment which makes this possible, and sometimes even encouraged. So there's this dynamic between an army top authority and military commanders on the ground and troops who are actually on the ground committing atrocities, you know? And that is a very difficult dynamic, considering that there's unlikely to be a very clear order to behave in a certain way, if that makes sense.
So what you're describing, if I understand, is there's no chain of command. It's down which an instruction is given, and I don't think anyone would think that. But there is a permissive environment, if you like. So we need to dispel that idea, which was very commonplace after the My Lai atrocities in the 60s in Vietnam, that this was somehow a sort of aberration, a kind of horrific, psychotic group, an outburst of group psychosis that was very aberrant and unusual. What you're describing to me is something that, though not, as it were, instructed from on high formally, is nonetheless the logical end product of a series of military and social structures that create a permissive environment in which this kind of war crime can and will happen. Is that a fair summation?
Yes, absolutely. And that also indicates that although it might not be likely that there's an order from above to commit these atrocities, it could be prevented with an order from above around controlling troops. You can control behavior, no? Social control, as in any society, you can also, militaries are very disciplinary institutions. No, so you can order troops to not do certain things and to behave in a certain ways. And if you don't do that, but rather you create a military culture in which sexualized violence is actually appreciated, and there might be peer pressure among soldiers that is encouraged, that is sexualized and violent, then you create an environment in which rape becomes almost the logical outcome, because the enemy, the women are dehumanized. They're fair game. They're fair game to be killed and hence also to be raped. So it is a complex dynamic, I think.
Do you think there's any significance one can attach to the fact that this particular, what happened at Bucha, is associated with retreat? Clearly, Putin's forces have not succeeded around Kyiv and are for now, and one, I think, has to be very careful in saying, that they won't go back. But for now, they appear to be heading eastwards. That this coincided with presumably a moment of collective disappointment, outrage, as Russian forces headed elsewhere. And is there a significance that, far from being necessarily associated with moments of conquest, that this particular form of atrocity can be committed at moments of not defeat, but of setback?
It could well be. I think we need more data to confirm that is the case here. But it's very clear that I think these atrocities, both the killings and the sexual violence, has to do with a letting go of military discipline, with a discipline that has to do with goals and military goals and so forth. There's a letting go of that, and it becomes about frustration, about loss of control, about last minute gains. It might have to do with entitlement. Men in general, we see that in peacetime as well. We see it certainly among very male-informed militaries, that there is a form of entitlement, thinking, well, but hey, I came here all this way and I haven't seen women for 3 months, and now they're saying that I have to do this, that, and that. No, I'm entitlement. I am entitled to having a bit of fun, and the women are dehumanized already. So things happen absolutely in moments of disarray. Yeah.
It's very interesting. You talk about data, of course, and rightly so. To slightly change the frame of the conversation, in terms of the tests of the potential jurisdictions we might be talking about in terms of future prosecutions, how realistic is it that we might be in a situation where we can bring charges against individuals? Because I'm conscious of the fact that, or indeed their superiors, as you implied, because one is conscious of course, that the forensic testing in a war zone is, in the collection of data in a war zone is so much more difficult than in peacetime. So, in those jurisdictions, can you let us know a little bit about how high the bar is?
Yeah, a very good question. And I think that because of the international tribunals in after the wars in former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, we have a very solid, detailed set of international rules and regulations with regard to evidence gathering and context in cases of sexual violence, which is very positive, which makes it in principle possible to prosecute. However, forensic evidence, no, it's unlikely that there is now a team that can collect forensic evidence from the bodies of those who have been abused. I don't think that that's necessarily what anyone needs at the moment either, and I think that that is a relevant point to make, considering the situation in which people are currently living. However, you can also wonder how much use it is to prosecute an 18-year-old soldier who has ended up in this chaos and mess, and if it's not, so whose responsibility is it that these things happen? No, and as we discussed before, military institutions are very hierarchical and tend to have strong discipline. So there is something to say for military commanders, troops commanders, but also so the military hierarchy above the troops, they bear responsibility what these troops do, because they give the sign of permissiveness or not. No, and that can go up all the way, of course. That can go up to Putin, who's the boss of the military, clearly. So yes, in that sense. So maybe it's more difficult to prosecute particular individual perpetrators for individual cases of individual women who would have to be identified. You certainly can prosecute for a series of atrocities of whom particular military commanders, of which they oversaw, using contextual evidence. That has been done before.
So Jilka, in this particular case, which is clearly going to tragically expand in its scale and scope, who is there one key figure, or are there many? Is the key figure the Ukrainian prosecutor general, Irina Veledikova, or are we actually looking at the chief prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, or both? I mean, who are the key figures?
Both, absolutely both. So both are key figures, and everything. Well, first, a war needs to stop. You can't prosecute in the middle. It's not useful to prosecute in the middle of combat. But when this at some point stops, then it's really important that there is collaboration between local teams and international teams. The other thing is that in order to, so instead, you don't really need the forensic evidence if you have the witnesses, no? And this is all public space, and everything happens in a particular violent context. So in principle, and according to international law, a victim survivor's testimony should be enough, considering the context, in order to be believed. Yeah. So that means that what we need post-conflict is an environment, a social, political, and legal environment in which victim survivors feel safe and not ashamed to speak up. And it's important that that is possible locally within Ukraine and internationally.
So, which raises a very interesting question, which is, this has been described as the first social media war. I'm not sure if that's quite right, but it's certainly the most social media war so far. It's also the most smartphone war so far, and it's one that in which we've had a tremendous amount of real-time data. So satellite imagery was able to dispel immediately the idea that this had been a put-up job by Ukrainians. Is one of the consequences of the sort of proliferation of data that's coming in the digital era, or in situations like this, going to make it easier to bring prosecutions, precisely because there is just so much, and allowing for the fact that going through millions and millions of hours of footage may be very, very difficult, but nonetheless, there is at least a greater chance. I mean, to interrupt the point, I noticed that it took 18 months for the My Lai atrocity between it happening and Seymour Hersh breaking the story. It doesn't work that way anymore. Therefore, is there a degree for very guarded optimism that some of the material that's being recorded every day, across Ukraine, may yet prove useful in subsequent prosecutions?
Absolutely. I think that there's no doubt about it that any kind of video evidence or photographic evidence or even witness statements in the moment that are online are useful as evidence for the future. I also think that there's a big danger in the sharing of all these images for obvious reasons. These are people's lives. And these are the things that happen to them, and it's very hard to see the sharing of videos of atrocities and bodies and the relentless sharing and resharing and so forth. And the idea that those images are there in the ether forever and ever, that must create additional trauma, doubtless. So I think that as a society, and this is not the first time, of course, and not the first instance or first circumstance in which this is relevant, that regulation of social media is ever more important. Absolutely.
And just a final question before I move on to speak to some colleagues, and we will come back to you, Jörg, of course. Just a rather a rather technical point, but one that fascinates me, which is in 2005, the United Nations made great play of R2P, the responsibility to protect. And this was presented as a response to the failures in the Balkans, in Rwanda, Somalia, and elsewhere. And it really ought to be now, if it was delivering as it was promised 17 years ago, an answer now, and it isn't. Should we just forget about R2P? Is it a dead letter?
I think R2P has been a dead letter for quite a while, and definitely since Syria, for example, we had R2P confronted with the atrocities committed in Syria as well, and nothing happened. So yes, I think that's from my perspective, it's a complete dead letter. It doesn't mean anything in real life, in the real life of people, yes, nor in international relations. It's, you know, it's terms that are being thrown around, but it doesn't have consequences. So yeah, no,
that makes sadly a great deal of sense. Thank you, Helga. We'll come back to you. I'd like to turn, if I may, to my colleague Ella Hill, who's been working hard on this subject with a view to a sense maker, which I believe is scheduled for this week. Is that correct, Ella?
Yes, for Friday. Friday. Yes.
Rather than ask you ill-informed questions, why don't you tell us what you've found out and where your investigations have led you?
Yes, so I think without repeating too much of what Jelke has told us, and thank you very much, Jelke, for being here this evening. What the sense maker is going to be trying to do is to understand, in this particular context, in this particular war, how likely is it that we will see some convictions or some results for cases of sexual violence that are reported, and what will happen in a potential court or a tribunal. And I think that the sense that I've got from speaking to various experts who work on rape as a weapon of war is that from past examples, it is the case that the vast majority of victims don't see justice at the end of these tribunals. The ICC has had, I think, one successful prosecution for sexual violence, another one that was overturned. And so if an eventual case were to go to the ICC, it's difficult to say exactly what the outcome might be. We've had more success from examples like the tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where there were 32 convictions for sexual violence and rape, but the numbers are really very small, and it is also, unfortunately, we are talking about it a great deal now, which I think is good in the sense that it brings attention to these atrocities, but when it comes to prosecutions at the ICC or a tribunal, there will be very many other crimes that will need to be paid attention to as well. And there is always the risk that with crimes against women, and especially with sexual violence, that they may not be at the top of the agenda. I hope that isn't the case. Also, just the sort of difficulty that we've seen in the past of successfully prosecuting these cases could mean that there would be similar problems again.
Ella, that's so interesting. And have you found that lessons have been learned since the previous engagements between the court and the aftermath of wars of conflict? in this and other regards? I mean, is there at least a some form of upward gradient in sensitivity, data collection, an understanding of what you just said, really, which is which has this horrible sound of authenticity, really, that in a war crime tribunal, this might not be a priority. And yet, when one hears, what Jelka says about the role that this plays, it is clearly wrong that should be so. So, are you seeing? I suppose my question is, have you detected any improvement, at least, in the way that the court is trying to understand, and investigators and prosecutors are trying to understand the granularity, the personal dimension, the emotional cost of this?
Yeah, so I think that we've had statements from Ukraine's Prosecutor General and from the ICC that they will be devoting attention to sexual violence and rape in Ukraine, and that they are dedicating resources to investigate that, which I think is a good sign. And I think that, like Jelka said, we've got data collection going on now. We've got organizations that are taking testimony from survivors, taking testimony from women who have made it across the border, and that all counts for a lot. We have information that can be used. It's just a question of ensuring that that those survivors in that testimony, you have to be able to make it to a trial as well. You have to be able to be in a position where you've got people that are willing to testify as well, and so it needs to be treated with a great deal of sensitivity by the courts in the way that they handle this.
And do you think it would be a good change if individuals could be prosecuted in absentia? Because it seems to me that one of the complexities in all of this is that it's a given that there has to be regime change, because Putin and or his chief lieutenants have to be put in the dock. And yet, oftentimes, there are situations where, in different situations, different jurisdictions, individuals are charged in absentia. Would that be a just reform? Would it be a breach of basic legal morals? What do you think about that?
I think that potentially one of the complicating factors with this particular theatre of war is potentially that some women will not be able to identify the perpetrators. It's different to, say, Bosnia, where a victim might have known the person because they were from the same community. And in this case, it's soldiers where they aren't necessarily captives. It is soldiers that are coming into a place and then going somewhere else. And so I mean that's a complicating factor. And then but then I suppose it comes to that point about the chain of command, which is, can we establish that someone that we can identify knew what was going on with some subordinates and didn't do anything to stop it. To the point about trials in absentia, I'm not sure on that point, to be honest.
Yes, no. I mean, it's a notoriously complex area of law, and it may also, just looking at this from a strategic point of view, not serve the purpose that the ICC was set up to perform if we start holding empty chair trials. And thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to you. Can I go to my fellow editor Giles Whittell, who knows much more about these things than me, and a lot about the region. Giles, I mean, first question to ask, I suppose, is the weekend's horrors, the reports coming out, had the feeling of, at the very least, being a punctuation mark in the conflict in the first 7 weeks. Has it, do you think, made any real difference to the balance of the strategic balance in the conflict?
The short answer is no. I think it may prove to have coincided with a punctuation mark in the conflict for broader strategic reasons, among them retreat from Kiev, acceptance in Moscow of very high casualty rates, even if they're not published in Russia, a stock taking which will have to happen in the Russian military about lost hardware as well as soldiers, and a recalibration of their whole war aims. But I think you'll find, well, I know you'll find, because we did an analysis, or let me be frank, we used the BBC Monitoring's analysis of the way Bucha was reported in Russia to show that it's simply not being reported. The allegations are reported, but immediately, as you know, framed as fakes, to use Sergei Lavrov's words. And unfortunately, my distinct impression is that that is widely believed across Russia. It's not just a metropolitan audience. You know, we're talking probably 120 out of the population of 140 million across 11 time zones. The propaganda has deep roots, firm hold. It'll take generations for this country to admit that it's been sold such a comprehensive package of lies, if it ever does. Let's recall that Memorial has been disbanded, the human rights group, before Russia ever came close to acknowledging the horrors of its Soviet past. They've never been acknowledged. So, so I think the entirely legitimate and extremely important outrage across the Western world won't be reflected in Russia, where it really matters, if any of the perpetrators are to be brought to justice, because, as you say, what's really required is regime change first. Let's remember that in any other historical cases of war criminals being brought to justice, Nuremberg, Serbia, but Nuremberg is the most striking case, and it's sort of following a continental scale conflict. It was preceded by comprehensive military victory, unconditional surrender. It was only in those circumstances that you could actually bring individuals to the dock and begin to see where the precepts of international law could take you. Ditto, if I'm not mistaken, I lose track of the different NATO campaigns in the Balkans, but Milosevic and Mladic were both in the dock in The Hague, but only after military defeat, only after regime change. So what's the point? There's, I mean, an extremely important point that my impression is that this lesson has been learned a bit in Syria, where diligent evidence gathering took place throughout the 11 years of the war, even though people were aware that Syria is not a states party to the ICC, because there's no statute of limitations on rape or murder or any war crimes. So this evidence can be stored and used at any time. But also, of course, and this will be no consolation to the victims in Ukraine, the more you gather evidence, the more meticulously you do it, the more you shout about it, the more it's possible that that process becomes a deterrent against regimes which might otherwise be inclined to sanction rape as a weapon of war in the future. So, I mean,
Do you think, Giles, that there was some very moving footage of President Zelensky, at which clearly, I think for the first time, looking weary. I mean, he's sort of performed to a superhuman extent for 7 weeks as this, you know, the face of Ukrainian valor and resistance. And who can blame him for going there and looking a little weary? I mean, I don't think we can draw huge conclusions from that. He's a human being. But the question that made me wonder about was whether we now move into a phase where, alas, it appears that we're going to be hearing a lot more of this. Does that make his task easier or harder? I mean, do we assume that, you know, Zelensky is heading towards some sort of peace deal, very much on his own terms, but nonetheless a deal he can put to the Ukrainian people? I mean, he has said as much. Does this make it harder because the revolutions are so gut-wrenchingly appalling, or easier because, you know, every nation has a limit?
Yeah, harder or easier, you mean to sell a deal to his people?
Yes.
I think my impression is he has the people behind him, and they'll go for a deal that he recommends. The heartbreaking thing from the point of view of, you know, today's exam question and justice for victims of war crimes is that it'll probably be a messy deal with which both sides are deeply unhappy, forced on them by the horrific alternative, which is the continuation of the carnage, and a deal in which, as I say, Putin stays in power, and so there is no justice in a courtroom. And I just wanted to add one point to that, which is that unfortunately there's a semi-plausible scenario in which you do have regime change, but you don't have justice, because unfortunately, I think the least likely outcome is the one we all want, which is revolutionary crowds in the streets, echoes of August 1990, clean sweep, and a democratic successor regime which willingly, enthusiastically hands over the perpetrators. A more likely result of the kind of regime that Putin has built, which is, Roderick Lyne, the former ambassador, explained to us the other day, is very pointy, pyramidal, with no one really on hand at a high level to dislodge Putin, is undermining my own argument here, because I think his point was that if there were a Politburo, then a coup would be more likely. All I'm saying is that I think some kind of an inside job is conceivable, but I don't think it would bring justice much closer necessarily. It's a forlorn hope.
And just one final question on Putin himself, which is that we've now reached a point where Biden, Johnson, many others have branded him explicitly a war criminal. And I noticed today that Johnson used the word genocide, which is one that Western governments tend to be very wary of using for obvious reasons. Does that put Putin in a corner, or is it useful to try and unite the free world around that central fact? Or both?
I think it's ill-advised. I think use of the word genocide will split well-intentioned liberals rather than unite them. I don't think there's any doubt that on the evidence available, these are war crimes, crimes against humanity. Whether they're genocidal or not is ultimately a semantic question for down the line. Yes, in a sense, the one respect in which it may be constructive is to telegraph to those who could be in a position to force regime change from within that is where the Western leaders are headed. Personally, I think for those reasons, for Biden, who's been accused in the last few days of serial gaffes and has made them, and it's not been helpful, to say in a clearly exasperated, off-the-cuff way, this guy's a war criminal. I think that is self-evidently sort of a reflection of what everyone's feeling, looking at these images, and it's useful so that, in a sense, that's the soundbite that the Channel 1 has to go with if it's going to go with anything from Biden on the evening news bulletin. And it's a challenge. Well, explain that to your viewers, guys. So I think that's useful. Personally, I'm a bit of a pedant about the use of the word genocide. However, I do notice in the chat, Henry Thompson gave a diametrically opposite answer to me as your earlier question about whether the horror of what's been exposed makes it easier or harder for Zelensky, as it makes it harder. You may well be right, Henry. I don't know.
Henry, do you want to elaborate on that point? Looking for Henry.
Hang on. That's me.
Hi, Henry.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Can you hear me?
Elaborate on that point, because
I was in Lviv for a couple of weeks ago, on the end of the first big refugee sort of exodus, working for one of these companies that does security for media crews. And my Ukrainian fixer has since been working in...
Oh, Henry, you've frozen.
Email the other day, which was very interesting,
That's
saying
better.
that he'd been talking to some local soldiers, and the local soldiers had been saying that they were appalled at the idea that Zelensky would go down the road of offering a peace deal. In other words, that when the news of the rapes and the killings was sort of breaking, that there was a feeling of great anger, and they rejected entirely the idea that Zelensky would go down the road of negotiating a peace deal. And in that respect, that essentially it was making it harder, and that's why I made that comment about it. It makes it harder, and certainly I think that's the feeling at the moment. But how that will stay that way, I have no idea. How long that will stay, those sentiments will stay, I have no idea.
Indeed, and we are, as you imply, we're in week 7 of a potentially much longer conflict. But that's fascinating, Henry. Thank you. Can I go to Francis Rafferty? Francis, I don't know if you're there, but you make a very interesting point about what happens to the perpetrators after the conflict. Are you online, Francis?
Yeah, I mean, I have no knowledge of this. I just kind of think that...
Good to see you, by the way.
Hello, hi, Matthew. I've thought about this before, particularly in Ethiopia, where we've been talking about in kind of quite technical terms, and then these people who've been through this, for whatever reason that they've been raping or whatever they're doing, and then they have to go back to their families, and And I just wondered whether anybody had kind of looked at what happened to them, to their families. I mean, you know, if you're at home and you're seeing what's happening, say in Ethiopia or lots of other places that we've talked about, that you would have a rapist coming home to you. It's just a thought, and I think everybody's deeply traumatized by it, and I think they should just kind of takes it further on. So it's just a question more than anything, any knowledge that I have.
I think it's a fascinating question because I mean, if you look at there's quite a lot of data on suicidality, completed suicide, alcoholism, domestic violence amongst returning German and Austrian forces after the Second World War. There may be other studies that I'm not unaware of, but I mean, it is interesting that the atrocities can often, you know, reap irreparable harm on not one society but two. So it's a very interesting and live question. Jelke, I'd like to come back to you, if I may, on the Ukraine, and you know, to return to the people, the individuals, because we've talked a lot about strategy and jurisdictions and legality, but obviously one of the things one is conscious of is what can the West do to actually help the victims of rape, and how can we, if at all, get expertise onto the ground quickly? I mean, is the Red Cross able to bring in the right kind of people to help, and beyond that, what can be done to assist individuals and communities on this, what I imagine is an immensely slow and arduous path back to some form of recovery?
Yeah, thank you. Just if I may, to make a comment in response to the question by Francis Rafferty about soldiers. There's ample research about veterans, US veterans coming home, UK veterans coming home, and you know, they come home from different types of conflicts that might be called far less atrocious than what we're seeing on the ground now in Ukraine. And the levels of domestic violence tend to rise among veterans all over, everywhere. And I think in these particular cases where really soldiers, you know, have to go home with everything that they have done, it creates more violence in homes. Absolutely. There's also likewise evidence that domestic violence in post-conflict societies more broadly, independent of soldiers or ex-combatants, rises. So a traumatized population tends to be more violent also within their domestic unit. So all of this goes back to your question, of course, so what can we do in order to support the populations in order to hopefully mitigate that long-term trauma which might stay there for long. So I don't know what exactly the Red Cross or other organizations are doing now, but I know that there are, for example, local phone lines, so local women's organizations who are taking calls from women, where women can report rape and sexual assault now currently. So that is a form of collecting data. I think you can map what happens where, for example, geographically by that kind of action. There are medical interventions that you can think of, no? So from rape kits with medical supplies, including morning after pills. I mean, it's horrific to think about, but we must think of the fact
absolutely
that there is a chance of conception in these cases, which makes everything more problematic still. So rape kits is one thing, And one of the things, of course, but again, you first need peace in order to do that, is trauma counseling for everyone, for victim survivors. But you also need, and that goes back to the question that Francis asked, is that you also need to do something with all those returning soldiers. No, you can't prosecute them all, you can't lock them up all, but you do need to do something with them if you don't want them to continue to wreck their own communities. And that is about lengthy specialist therapy and trauma counseling. Yeah.
So is there any way of doing that in real time? I mean, we talk about the Red Cross and you know, I wonder whether there is a way of at least starting the process before the conflict ends, or is that simply too difficult?
It's a good question, and I don't think that there has been. So apart from sort of very tangible interventions, rape kits, things that you can bring to people, I'm not sure if there is a possibility to actually start with counseling processes, for example, but they're concrete. So evidence gathering is also a form of symbolic justice. Yeah, so it's not, justice is multifaceted, and it's not only criminal justice, because we've heard already earlier in the conversation how difficult and unlikely it's going to be in the next couple of years, maybe in the future, but it's not going to be immediate. So there are other forms of justice, and that might have to do with visibility, with creating an environment of respect and of being able to share stories, being able to report, collect data, and those are very valuable interventions that we can start with now. Even having this conversation and recognizing that this is happening and that is a problem is a form of recognition, of respect to a certain extent. So we need to keep on raising it and keep on thinking about it.
You've done a lot of work in Latin America, I believe, on conflict. Are there any lessons from those conflicts that translate to what's going on in Ukraine? I imagine many.
Well, the conversation has been really interesting, and yes, indeed, I constantly make that link to the Latin American cases. One of the things is that criminal justice doesn't come immediately, and perhaps doesn't have to be the priority immediately after conflict. There might be other priorities, also because you first need regime change, of course. But we've seen it with Pinochet. No, it has taken years, decades, but it's still a form of justice. We've seen it with Rios Montt in Guatemala. It's still a form of justice, even if it's not ideal. We've seen it with Hissène Habré in Chad, who was convicted of sexual violence a couple of years ago, completely after the fact, but it's still a form of justice. And even if it doesn't bring justice to all the victim survivors, it brings symbolic justice to all the victim survivors by recognizing and by a court recognizing and convicting someone for such crimes is really important, even if it isn't individual justice for the individuals, victim survivors. And we see that in Latin America as well, and throughout the few cases that we know where successful prosecutions have taken place.
It's interesting because one of the things you said earlier that just sort of made me sit up in kind of alarm and horror was and of course it makes all the sense in the world once you say it, is that there is a shame culture that attaches to rape, alas, and therefore, you know, many of the women victims who survive this process will face a secondary punishment. And I wonder if whether there are ways in which outside agencies, NGOs, at whatever stage in the conflict, can be mobilized to try and at least minimize the impact of that secondary punishment.
Absolutely, and I think that so I think that as somebody also says in the chat, recognition is a key part of the process. It's really important, and I think that all of us who are not now in Ukraine but who have the privilege of being safe and sound need to, for example, counter the fetishization of sexual violence of Ukrainian women, the sharing of images of rape on social media. All of that happens as well, and that happens in our European or peacetime societies, and that's something that brings injury, additional injury to harm. Those are things that we have to counter as well. Likewise, trafficking. Lots of vulnerable women and children, young girls who are very vulnerable within the refugee streams that are coming across the borders. They're vulnerable to trafficking. We know it's happening. And this is, as soon as they're over the border, we can, we should be able not only to protect women, no, we should be able to do something about those trafficking groups. And I think that those are really important interventions. It's not, it doesn't only happen there. There's a culture on our side as well that we really have to fight.
As someone who follows this, in extraordinary detail and with attention to, both the analytical framework and the evidence, do you have a sense of the scale of what we're dealing with here? There have been many conflicts in which rape has been a weapon of war. Are we facing something that is, do you think, going to be, if not transformative of our knowledge of this and our understanding of it, and hopefully the way that we deal with it? Is this different, at least in degree, if not in kind, to previous conflicts?
It's difficult to know, to be honest. As you mentioned earlier, we're only in what day are we in, or week of this?
41 or 2, yeah.
It's only that. I have the feeling that it really depends on where this is going the next couple of weeks. If this is going to continue as it has been the last couple of weeks, then I think the atrocities will only escalate. But there might be a change. It seems to me that we can't draw conclusions too quick at this moment.
No, exactly. I mean, it's very hard to know whether, given the state of the negotiations, whether this might end. I mean, I doubt it will, but conceivably it could end quite quickly. But then again, when you look at the content of the negotiations, it's hard to see that. Sometimes it's hard to see that it will end ever. One hopes that it's sooner rather than later. Alas, we're drawing to the end of what I found a harrowing but very informative hour. A few takeaways. I think what Jelke had to say about shame culture and, as it were, the secondary impacts of rape as a weapon of war are really important insights and things that we should look into. Also, the military discipline or lack thereof within the Russian army, the signals that have been sent, the dog whistle signals that have been sent down the chain of command, and how explicit or implicit they are. What Ella had to say about the problems of forensic evidence and the not encouraging record of the ICC so far, it clearly a massive issue, and one that we have some time, I think, perhaps to address, because one thing that you can be sure is that whatever else is true about the ICC and this conflict, the cases, if they ever reach The Hague, will not reach The Hague immediately. I also noted with great interest the the point made about social media, that there are and digital records, that there's a two-edged sword. That first, they may have considerable forensic value, but they also have the capacity to compound the suffering of the victims. And I think this is perhaps an issue it would be worth Tortoise taking to the tech platforms and asking how they're dealing with it and what they propose to do about it in a more systematic way. They're not always responsive, but sometimes they are. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Ella and Giles, very much for their terrific insights. I'd particularly like to thank Jelke for giving us such a difficult discussion and with such clarity and candor and knowledge, and we're really grateful to you. Thank you very much. I'm sure this is not the last time we shall address this issue. It is too important not to keep coming back to it. It is horrible, but it's part of our journalistic covenant not to avert our gaze, and we won't. Meanwhile, we'll be back in the newsroom tomorrow, and of course online with discussion with Minouche Shafik on what we owe each other, and on Monday, looking back on 40 years since the Falklands. Meanwhile, thank you all very much for joining us. Have a very good evening and see you again very soon.